So I think that pastoral teams are dealing with more emotional complexity inside schools than ever before. And you can see it almost everywhere now. You've got more anxiety, more emotionally dysregulated behaviour, attendance difficulties, safeguarding pressure. You've got staff that are really, really tired as well. And I think what makes it particularly difficult is that a lot of these challenges are not always extreme enough to trigger immediate intervention. But they are constant, and so it's that kind of low-level emotional strain that slowly builds across a school community over kind of a period of time. And so I kind of termed it as this kind of hidden crisis. You've got students that are struggling silently. You've got staff that are having these firefighting conversations all day, and that's very tiring. And your pastoral team as a whole is always reacting to the next issue. And despite enormous kind of effort from schools, so many teams feel stuck in this reactive pastoral care state. So your support is arriving after the attendance has dropped, or after the behaviour is escalated, or after the relationships have broken down. You know, the list goes on. And to be clear, I don't think that schools don't care enough. I think they care really, really deeply, but I do think they misunderstand a big part of the problem, because I'm not convinced that schools only have a mental health crisis to deal with. I think they're also facing a huge emotional education gap. And that's what this is what I'm here to kind of talk about today. You've got this hidden assumption, and this assumption is built into so many pastoral systems. And the assumption is that we assume that students naturally develop emotional understanding as they grow older. And I'm not sure that's true. And you think about the language that in schools that students hear all the time. They always hear someone standing on a stage saying, talk to someone, use a coping strategy, or ask for help. And they're good messages, can't argue with that, but they also require something very important underneath them. They require emotional self-awareness to be able to understand that they need to go away and do that thing. They also, the gap between someone saying that ask for help and student actually making that jump and doing that is huge. But so in my experience, the vast majority of students genuinely struggle to identify what they're feeling in the first place, not because they're unwilling or they don't care, but because emotional understanding is actually very, very complex. So students can't distinguish frustration from anxiety, or overwhelm from shame, or stress from just exhaustion, emotional exhaustion, or anger from embarrassment. That's a big one, by the way. And they don't even pause to consider what that feeling is. So the broad range of emotions that we get to experience as humans, which by the way is a massive privilege, and we should all be kind of turning up that emotional volume dial inside ourselves, like allowing them. That broad range just gets narrowed down into a few key sentences, and you would have all heard students say, I'm stressed, oh no, I'm fine, or they don't say anything at all. And if they can't accurately identify what they're experiencing internally, then it becomes near on impossible, very, very difficult to then communicate that externally. So instead, they're going to suppress, they're going to avoid, they're going to isolate, they're going to mask, or they're going to react in random ways. And so by the time that support is accessed, that emotional difficulty would have become far more complex. And this is where we think that emotional kind of foundations become really, really important, because emotional education is not, let's just talk about our feelings. It's the ability to recognize our emotions, understand the patterns in ourselves, articulate our experiences clearly, and then create some space, a physical space, or the feeling of physical space between the emotion arriving and then our reaction. And that's a skill set. And like any skill set, that needs to be taught, so it needs to be scaffolded, it needs to be repeated, it needs to be practiced over time. But in so many schools, emotional understanding is treated as something that students need to just passively absorb. And so maybe they're doing that through assemblies or awareness weeks, or they put some posters on the wall, or it's like a one-off wellbeing activity. I'm not discounting those things, they definitely matter. But as educators, we know something important about learning is that repetition matters, scaffolding matters, having a shared language really matters, and then consistent exposure also, that matters. I'm a PE teacher originally, I would never expect a student to become a confident sprinter, let's say, after hearing a one-off assembly from a famous ex-sprinter. Now, the assembly could have been great message, really thought-provoking, really inspiring, but they have to do that thing themselves in order to become good at that thing. And sometimes emotionally, we expect students to develop this hugely sophisticated self-awareness with very little structured support. And then we're surprised when the emotions emerge behaviourally instead, because emotion has to come out at some point, even if that's kind of in a slightly sideways way. So through withdrawal or avoidance or shutdown or defensiveness or conflict, poor attendance. And so often, especially with teenagers, who you see this kind of defensive defiance quite a lot, if you dig down underneath that challenging behaviour, it's so often not. It's just emotional confusion. And they just have no idea how they feel or how to make sense of that. And so I think this is one of the key reasons why pastoral systems become reactive over time. It's because schools are so often structured to only respond when an emotional difficulty becomes visible. So that's once the attendance has dropped, or a safeguarding concern kind of emerges or gets referred on, or maybe a student has hit that intervention kind of threshold. But we know that the difficulty would have started a long time before that moment. And so the challenge, and there's a couple of challenges, but that a withdrawn student is always going to be harder to spot than a disruptive one. And some students are going to be louder when they're struggling, and some are going to be quieter. And, a quiet student can disappear emotionally for a long time before anybody realizes. But I also think inconsistency is a challenge as well. So you've got different staff responding differently, different pastoral conversations happening in different ways, and there's some horrendously poor advice still being dished out, by the way. And school students are going to receive mixed messages, and when schools are under pressure, especially pastorally, the systems always become more fragmented, which is understandable. But I think the key shift is that most schools are responding to emotional outcomes rather than building emotional foundations. And those are two very, very different things. And so for me, the conversation is not how do I intervene better, or how do we intervene better as a pastoral team. It's also how do we get students to intervene better for themselves. And the key part is the end of that sentence, the for themselves bit, the proactive part. So if I put my teacher hat on, how do I in the classroom get students to be proactive? It's gradually, it's consistently, it's in really low stakes environments, not during the moment of crisis itself. And if I kind of use like a science lab analogy, if a science teacher is putting on an experiment and there's dangerous chemicals and test tubes all over the place, that is not the time when they want to embed the rules and the routines and the expectations of how to be in a science lab. They would have done that way before to make sure that they're ready for the slightly bigger experiment. And I think the schools that are managing pastoral care the best at the moment are beginning to treat emotional literacy and awareness as education rather than as intervention. And that means that they have a shared language amongst the staff. They have consistent routines. They have small repeated conversations. They've normalized reflection. They have emotionally informed staff that are responding in an emotionally informed way, and they've scaffolded emotional understanding over time. That's not an intense process. That's just a consistent process. And they're the things that slowly change the culture. So as a result of those things, students will begin to recognize their emotions earlier. Pastoral conversations then happen earlier. So your support requests become much more clearer. Staff confidence also improves. And as a result of all those things put together, the emotional safety of your school increases. And importantly, the key starting point of this is students beginning to develop a better understanding of themselves before that crisis point arrives. And so I think over the next kind of few years, schools will continue to face a huge emotional complexity, and I don't think there's one big quick fix for that. But I do think that one of the most important kind of shifts that schools can make is moving from being purely reactive pastorally to being proactive in an emotional education sense, because students are not going to suddenly become emotionally articulate during a crisis. And remember, for a student who's experiencing an emotion maybe for the first time ever, that is going to feel huge to them. So those skills need to be built gradually. They need to be built much earlier, and that's a very intentional process. So I genuinely think that the schools that understand that over the next 5 or 10 years are going to be the ones that cope significantly better than the ones that don't. And yeah, that's my thoughts for the day. I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for sticking around to the end.